White manager kicks black girl out of school clothes store, not realizing she's the new owner's daughter. "You don't belong here," the woman snapped, her voice cold and sharp, echoing through the polished aisles of the upscale clothing store. She crossed her arms, staring down the young girl with a mix of disdain and irritation. The girl, barely 13, clutched a brightly colored sweater she had been admiring. Her chocolate-brown eyes widened in confusion. "I'm just looking around," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't think so," the woman retorted. Her name tag read Karen Manager, and she stood like a guard at the gates. "This is not your kind of store. Leave, now." The girl froze, her feet rooted to the floor as if her sneakers had been glued to the shiny tiles. Other shoppers turned their heads, some whispering, others avoiding the confrontation entirely. "I'm not stealing," the girl protested, holding the sweater up as if to prove her innocence. Karen snatched the sweater from her hands. "I said leave," she barked, pointing toward the glass doors. Just as the girl backed away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, a voice rang out. It was deep, authoritative, and undeniably angry. "What is going on here?" The store went silent. Karen turned, her confidence faltering as a tall man stepped out of an office at the back of the store. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding attention. "I was handling a situation," Karen stammered, trying to recover. "She doesn't belong here. She's causing trouble." The man's expression darkened. He turned to the girl who had stopped in her tracks. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. The girl nodded hesitantly, wiping her eyes. "Good," the man said, then turned back to Karen, his voice cutting like ice. "Because this young lady is my daughter." Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Earlier that day, the girl, whose name was Ava, had woken up excited. It was her first time visiting her father's new store since he had taken over as the owner. He had promised to let her pick out anything she wanted, a small treat to celebrate his hard work. Ava's dad, Mr. James Harris, had worked tirelessly to build his career. He'd started in retail, climbing the ranks over the years through sheer determination. This store was his dream come true, a high-end boutique that catered to a wealthy clientele. Ava had always admired his resilience and was proud to call him her dad. Dressed in her favorite yellow hoodie and jeans, Ava had arrived at the store just after lunch. She wanted to surprise her dad, who was busy in his office meeting with vendors. She decided to wander around the store, marveling at the displays and racks of colorful clothes. But her excitement didn't last long. Karen, the store manager, had spotted Ava near the racks of sweaters. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the girl pick up an item and examine the price tag. In her mind, Ava didn't fit the image of someone who could afford to shop there. Karen approached Ava with a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Ava smiled politely. "No, thank you. I'm just looking." Karen's smile vanished. "Are you sure you can afford anything in here?" Ava blinked, caught off guard. "I'm just looking," she repeated softly. Karen's demeanor grew colder. "Well, this is not a playground," she said sharply. "If you're not buying anything, I need you to leave." Ava felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She had already decided Ava didn't belong. When Ava hesitated to leave, Karen raised her voice, drawing the attention of the other shoppers. It was humiliating, and Ava didn't understand why it was happening. And that's when her dad walked in. The scene in the store shifted dramatically. Mr. Harris's presence was enough to make everyone freeze. He placed a protective arm around Ava's shoulder, his gaze never leaving Karen. She's your daughter." Karen stuttered, her face pale. "Yes," Mr. Harris said firmly. "And you owe her an apology. Right now." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked around as if searching for support, but the other employees and customers stayed silent. I didn't know," she finally muttered, her voice trembling. That doesn't make it okay. Mr. Harris replied, his voice low but dangerous. Is this how you treat all our customers, or just the ones who don't look the way you expect? Karen's lip quivered. I didn't mean. I don't want excuses, Mr. Harris interrupted. I want an apology to my daughter. And then I want you in my office. Ava looked up at her dad, her chest swelling with a mix of relief and pride. She had never seen him this angry, but it was clear he wouldn't let anyone treat her unfairly. Karen turned to Ava, her eyes avoiding the girl's gaze. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her voice barely audible. Ava didn't respond. She didn't trust Karen's apology, and she didn't feel like pretending she did. Mr. Harris guided Ava toward his office, leaving Karen to face the judgmental stares of the other employees. But as the door to the office closed, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And she was right. Karen sat stiffly in the office chair, her eyes darting nervously as Mr. Harris closed the door behind him. The room, with its sleek desk and shelves lined with business awards, suddenly felt like a courtroom, and she was on trial. Mr. Harris leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with barely restrained anger. Ava sat quietly on a small couch nearby, her gaze fixed on her hands. Let's start with this, Mr. Harris began. What exactly made you think it was acceptable to treat my daughter the way you did? Karen shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know she was your daughter, she said quickly. If I had... Stop, Mr. Harris cut her off, his tone sharp. Her being my daughter doesn't matter. She could have been anyone. A regular customer, a child passing through, anyone. Why did you treat her that way? Karen's face turned red. I thought she was loitering. She wasn't dressed like someone who would shop here. Ava's head snapped up at that, her eyes narrowing. She wanted to say something, but her dad held up a hand, silently signaling her to wait. So let me get this straight, Mr. Harris said slowly, his voice cold. You judged her based on her clothes? Or was it something else? Something about her skin? Karen's jaw dropped. No, I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? Mr. Harris pressed, because it's hard to interpret it any other way. Did she do something wrong? Did she steal something? Did she act suspiciously? Karen shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. No, but... There is no but, Mr. Harris snapped. You humiliated a child, my child, and not just in private. You did it loudly, in front of customers, as if she was some kind of criminal. And now you're trying to excuse it. Karen looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I'm sorry, she mumbled. Sorry isn't enough, Mr. Harris replied firmly. You've shown me that you can't be trusted to represent this store or the values I've worked so hard to build. You're done here. Karen's head shot up. What, you're firing me? Yes, Mr. Harris said without hesitation. Effective immediately. Karen looked stunned, but her shock quickly turned to desperation. Please, Mr. Harris, I've worked here for years. I've been loyal. And this is how you repay that loyalty. He interrupted. By driving away customers and making assumptions about people based on how they look? I can't have someone like you running my store. Karen's lips trembled as she realized there was no room for negotiation. She stood shakily, casting a pleading glance at Ava, who stared back at her with a mix of defiance and hurt. Please, Karen said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do anything to make this right. Mr. Harris didn't waver. What's done is done. You'll receive your final paycheck, and I'll expect your resignation letter on my desk by the end of the day. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped herself. She grabbed her bag, her face a mask of defeat, and left the office without another word. Ava exhaled deeply once Karen was gone, her small frame relaxing for the first time since the confrontation began. Dad, she said softly. Yes, sweetheart. Mr. Harris replied, his voice instantly gentle as he knelt beside her. Did she really hate me because of my skin? Ava asked, her eyes brimming with tears. Mr. Harris pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. I don't know what was in her heart, he said honestly, But what she did was wrong, and I promise I'll never let anyone treat you like that again. Ava nodded, sniffling into his shoulder. After a moment, Mr. Harris pulled back and gave her a small smile. How about we pick out something nice for you? Anything you want. It's on the house. Ava's face brightened a little, and she nodded. Okay. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Word of Karen's dismissal spread quickly among the staff, who were eager to prove their loyalty to the new owner. Ava picked out a beautiful dress and a pair of sparkly sneakers, feeling a little more like herself as the day went on. But the unease lingered. That evening, as Mr. Harris was locking up the store, Ava noticed something strange. Karen's car was still parked in the lot, even though she had left hours ago. Why is she still here? Ava asked, pointing to the car. Mr. Harris frowned, his eyes narrowing. Stay here, he said, his tone serious. He approached the car cautiously, his phone in hand in case he needed to call for help. As he got closer, he saw movement inside the vehicle. Karen was sitting in the driver's seat, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. Karen? He called out. She looked up, startled, and quickly rolled down her window. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice trembling. I was just about to leave. Why are you still here? He asked, his tone wary. Karen hesitated, glancing at her phone. I wanted to talk to you. One last time, please. Mr. Harris crossed his arms. You've already said everything you needed to say. No, Karen insisted, her voice rising. You don't understand. There's something you need to know. Her words sent a chill down Mr. Harris's spine. He glanced back at Ava, who was watching from the store entrance. What is it? He demanded. Karen leaned forward, her eyes wide with desperation. It's not just me, she whispered. There are others. People in this store. People you trust. And they're worse than I ever was. Mr. Harris stared at her, his mind racing. What are you talking about? Karen's voice dropped to a whisper. They don't want you here. They don't want someone like you owning this place. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Mr. Harris stared at Karen, his mind struggling to process her words. The air around them felt heavy, charged with tension. Explain, he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen glanced nervously at the store entrance where Ava was watching. Not here, she whispered. Someone might see us talking. Mr. Harris clenched his jaw. He didn't trust Karen, not after what she had done to Ava, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be telling the truth. Fine, he said. But make it quick. Karen nodded and leaned closer. There's a group, she said quietly. Some of the employees. They've been here for years, long before you took over. They think the store should have stayed in the hands of the previous owner. And they don't like people like you running it. Mr. Harris's stomach tightened. He had worked hard to earn his position, to buy this store and turn it into something he and Ava could be proud of. The thought of his own staff undermining him was infuriating. Names, he said sharply. Karen hesitated, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I can't, she said finally. If they find out I told you, it'll be worse for me. You're already fired. Mr. Harris snapped. What do you have to lose? Karen's face crumpled. You don't get it, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't just about losing my job. They'll ruin me. And they'll ruin you too, if you're not careful. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. If you're not going to give me names, then this conversation is over. Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but she slumped back in her seat instead. Just be careful, she said finally. Watch your back. Without another word, Mr. Harris turned and walked back to the store, his shoulders stiff with tension. Ava ran up to him, her eyes wide with concern. Is everything okay? She asked. Mr. Harris forced a smile, ruffling her hair. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Let's go home. That night, Mr. Harris couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table long after Ava had gone to bed, staring at the stack of employee files in front of him. Karen's warning played over and over in his mind. He had inherited most of the staff from the previous owner, a decision he had made to ensure a smooth transition. But now he wondered if that had been a mistake. Who could he trust? The next morning, Mr. Harris arrived at the store early. He walked through the aisles, reading employees as they prepared for the day. He studied their faces, searching for signs of hostility or deceit, but everyone seemed friendly and professional. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around lunchtime, one of the assistant managers, a man named Greg, approached him. Greg was in his late 30s, with a polished appearance and an easy smile. He had been with the store for over a decade and was well liked by the staff. "Hey, Mr. Harris," Greg said, leaning casually against the counter. "Just wanted to check in and see how things are going." "Things are fine," Mr. Harris replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Why do you ask?" Greg shrugged. "No reason. I just know it's been a big adjustment for everyone since you took over. Change can be hard, you know." Mr. Harris studied Greg's face, trying to read between the lines. Was this just a friendly conversation, or was there something more to it? "I think the team is adapting well," Mr. Harris said carefully. Greg nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's good to hear. If you ever need help with anything, just let me know. I've been here a long time, so I know how things work around here." "I'll keep that in mind," Mr. Harris said, his tone cool. As Greg walked away, Mr. Harris felt a flicker of unease. Something about the man's demeanor seemed calculated, as if he was testing the waters. Later that afternoon, Mr. Harris decided to review the store's security footage. He told himself it was just to reassure Ava that everything was under control, but deep down he was searching for answers. The footage from the past week seemed normal at first. Employees restocked shelves, assisted customers, and carried out their usual tasks. But as Mr. Harris fast-forwarded through the recordings, he noticed something odd. In several clips, Greg and a few other longtime employees huddled together in quiet corners of the store. They'd spoke in low voices, glancing around as if they didn't want to be overheard. Mr. Harris's pulse quickened. Were they just chatting, or was this the group Karen had mentioned? As he continued watching, one particular clip caught his attention. It showed Greg and two other employees, Lisa and Mark, standing near the back exit late one evening. The store had already closed, and their conversation looked intense. Greg gestured animatedly, and Lisa nodded, her expression serious. Then Greg said something that made Mr. Harris' blood run cold. "She's just a kid," Lisa said, her voice faint but audible. Greg shook his head. "Doesn't matter. If he keeps bringing her around, we'll handle it, one way or another." Mr. Harris paused the video, his hands trembling with anger. They were talking about Ava. That evening, Mr. Harris locked the office door and sat down with the footage. He knew he needed a plan, a way to confront Greg and the others without putting himself or Ava in danger. But before he could decide on his next move, his phone buzzed with a text. "Unknown number. You're digging where you shouldn't. Stop now or you'll regret it." Mr. Harris stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. Mr. Harris stared at the screen of his phone, the anonymous message glaring back at him. He felt a wave of anger, but it was quickly overtaken by unease. This wasn't just about whispers in the store or subtle hostility anymore. Someone had gone out of their way to send a threat. Ava's safety came to the forefront of his mind. He needed to protect her at all costs. "Dad." Mr. Harris nearly jumped. Ava was standing at the door of his office, rubbing her eyes. She wore her favorite yellow hoodie, looking small and tired in the dim light. "What are you still doing up, sweetheart?" he asked, tucking his phone away and forcing a smile. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "You're working late again." Mr. Harris walked over and knelt in front of her. "I'm sorry, honey. There's just a lot going on right now. But I promise I'll be done soon and okay." Ava nodded, but her expression stayed worried. "Is it because of that lady from the store?" Mr. Harris hesitated. "Partly," he said truthfully. "But you don't need to worry about that. I've got everything under control." Ava bit her lip, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't press further. "Can I stay here with you for a while?" "Of course," Mr. Harris said, pulling up a chair for her. The next morning, Mr. Harris woke up with a clear resolve. He couldn't afford to let this escalate any further. He decided to dig deeper into the group Karen had mentioned, but he needed to do it carefully. As the day progressed, he kept a close eye on Greg, Lisa, and Mark. He noticed how they interacted with each other, how they spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was watching. Their behavior only confirmed his suspicions. Around lunchtime, he called a meeting with all the store's employees. It was a sudden decision, but he knew he needed to set the tone and make it clear that any form of sabotage or discrimination wouldn't be tolerated. Everyone gathered in the break room, murmuring quietly. Greg leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed, while Lisa and Mark exchanged glances. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Harris began, his voice steady. "I wanted to address something important." The room grew quiet. "This store is more than just a business to me," he continued. "It's a place where everyone, staff and customers alike, should feel welcome and respected. I won't tolerate anything that goes against that." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, scanning the faces in the room. "Recently, I've noticed behavior that doesn't align with those values," he said, his tone firm. "And let me be clear. If anyone here is involved in actions that harm this store or the people in it, there will be consequences." Greg's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, raising his hand. "Mr. Harris, are you accusing someone of something specific?" "I'm not naming names," Mr. Harris replied, meeting Greg's gaze, "but I'm watching closely." After the meeting, Mr. Harris returned to his office. He knew he had sent a message, but it wasn't enough. If Karen's warning was accurate, this group wouldn't back down easily. As he reviewed the store's finances and inventory records, something caught his eye. There were discrepancies, small amounts of money missing from the register, items listed as sold but unaccounted for in the inventory. His heart sank. Was this part of their plan to sabotage him? He printed out the records and placed them in a folder, determined to confront Greg and the others directly. Later that evening, as the store was closing, Mr. Harris called Greg into his office. Greg walked in with his usual air of confidence, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You wanted to see me?" Greg asked, sitting down casually in the chair across from the desk. "Yes," Mr. Harris said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Care to explain this?" Greg opened the folder and glanced at the papers. His expression didn't change, but Mr. Harris could see the slight twitch in his jaw. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," Greg said, closing the folder and leaning back in his chair. "These discrepancies," Mr. Harris said, his voice cold. "They've been happening consistently since I took over. And they all seem to point to someone with access to the registers and inventory." Greg shrugged. "Mistakes happen. It's a busy store." "These aren't mistakes," Mr. Harris said firmly. "They're deliberate, and I intend to find out who's responsible." Greg's smile returned, but it was icy. "Be careful, Mr. Harris. Accusations like this can backfire." "That sounds like a threat," Mr. Harris replied, his eyes narrowing. "Just a friendly warning," Greg said, standing up. "You're new here. Maybe you don't understand how things work yet." "I understand enough," Mr. Harris said, rising to his feet. "And I'll make one thing clear. If you or anyone else is involved in anything that harms this store, I will find out. And I won't hesitate to take action." Greg's smile faded completely. He gave a curt nod and walked out of the office without another word. That night, as Mr. Harris was locking up, he felt a strange sense of unease. The parking lot was unusually quiet, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. As he approached his car, he noticed something on the windshield. It was a folded piece of paper, weighed down by a rock. He picked it up and unfolded it, his heart pounding. "Stay out of it, or the next message will be worse." Mr. Harris stood frozen in the parking lot, the anonymous note crumpled in his hand. He scanned the dark lot, his pulse racing. The shadows felt alive, as if someone could be watching from the cover of night. He climbed into his car, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with questions. Who left the note? Was it Greg? Someone else in the group Karen had mentioned? Or was it an outsider altogether? When he arrived home, he parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long moment. He didn't want Ava to see him like this, nervous, shaken. She needed to feel safe, even if he didn't. Taking a deep breath, he went inside. Ava was waiting for him in the living room, a movie playing in the background. "Hey, Dad," she said, looking up from the couch. "You're late." "Sorry, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a busy day at work." "Did something happen?" she asked, tilting her head. Mr. Harris hesitated. He didn't want to burden her with the details, but he also didn't want to lie. "Just some issues at the store," he said carefully. "But nothing for you to worry about." Ava didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. That night, Mr. Harris barely slept. The note haunted him, and his mind kept replaying Greg's smug smile and Karen's cryptic warnings. By morning, he had made a decision. It was time to bring in outside help. He contacted a friend from his college days, Detective Marcus Reed. Marcus had a reputation for being sharp and thorough, and Mr. Harris trusted him implicitly. "Marcus, I need your help," Mr. Harris said when the detective arrived at the store later that day. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor. He listened carefully as Mr. Harris explained the situation, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "This sounds bigger than just workplace drama," Marcus said when Mr. Harris finished. "If someone's leaving threats and tampering with your business, it's criminal. We need to figure out who's behind it." "I don't have any solid proof yet," Mr. Harris admitted. "Just suspicions and that note." "Then we start there," Marcus said. "I'll take the note and have it analyzed. In the meantime, you should be extra cautious. Don't confront anyone unless you're sure they're involved." Over the next few days, Marcus worked quietly behind the scenes, reviewing security footage, analyzing the note, and interviewing employees under the guise of a routine security check. At the same time, Mr. Harris began noticing more subtle signs of sabotage. Displays were rearranged without permission, leaving expensive items vulnerable to damage. A shipment of high-end clothing mysteriously went missing, only to reappear in a storage closet days later. The tension in the store was palpable. Employees whispered in corners, customers sensed the unease, and Mr. Harris felt like he was walking a tightrope. Then one evening, Marcus called with an update. "I found something," Marcus said. "It's about Greg." "What is it?" Mr. Harris asked, his heart pounding. "Greg has a history," Marcus said. "Before he started working here, he was fired from another retail job for theft. They couldn't prove it at the time, but he was the main suspect in an embezzlement scheme. It's possible he's up to the same tricks here." Mr. Harris felt a mix of anger and vindication. He had suspected Greg, but now he had something concrete to back it up. "What do we do next?" he asked. "We need to catch him in the act," Marcus said. "If he's stealing from you or plotting something, we'll find evidence. But you have to stay patient. Don't let him know you're onto him." That weekend, Mr. Harris decided to install hidden cameras in the store. He didn't tell anyone, not even the assistant managers. The cameras were discreetly placed to cover blind spots in areas where suspicious activity had been reported. 2 days later, the cameras paid off. Late one evening, after the store had closed, Mr. Harris reviewed the footage from the previous night. He fast-forwarded through hours of routine activity until something caught his eye. Craig and Lisa were in the stockroom, speaking in hushed tones. Greg pulled out a large box labeled "New Arrivals" and opened it. Inside were several designer handbags, each worth hundreds of dollars. Lisa looked nervous. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Relax," Craig said. "It's a few bags. No one will notice." "What if Harris finds out?" Lisa pressed. Greg smirked. "He's too busy playing the hero with his kid. By the time he figures it out, we'll be long gone." Mr. Harris paused the footage, his hands shaking with anger. This was it, the proof he needed. The next morning, Mr. Harris called Marcus. "I have them," he said. "Greg and Lisa. Caught on camera." "Good," Marcus replied. Don't confront them yet. Let me handle it. We'll catch them red-handed. That evening, Marcus and two uniformed officers arrived at the store after closing. They waited in the back office while Mr. Harris reviewed the live camera feed. Sure enough, Greg and Lisa returned to the stockroom, their movements quick and practiced. They opened another box, this time filled with expensive watches, and began stuffing them into their bags. Marcus nodded to the officers. Let's move. The three men entered the stockroom quietly but decisively. Greg and Lisa froze, their faces pale as they realized they had been caught. What's going on? Greg said, trying to sound indignant. You're under arrest for theft, Marcus said, pulling out his badge. Lisa burst into tears while Greg glared at Mr. Harris. You set us up, he growled. You did that yourself, Mr. Harris replied coldly. As Greg and Lisa were led away in handcuffs, Mr. Harris felt a wave of relief, but deep down he knew this wasn't over. The store was eerily quiet the next morning. Word of Greg and Lisa's arrests had spread like wildfire among the employees. Whispers filled the aisles, customers sensed the tension, and Mr. Harris could feel the weight of every curious glance. But as much as the arrests had provided a sense of justice, they left behind more questions than answers. Who else was involved? And what was the endgame? Later that day, Marcus called Mr. Harris with an update. We're questioning Greg and Lisa now. So far, they're not saying much, but we're starting to piece things together. Do you think anyone else is involved? Mr. Harris asked. Marcus sighed. It's likely. Greg isn't the type to act alone. Someone else is pulling strings, and we need to figure out who before they make their next move. Mr. Harris rubbed his temples. I've already started reviewing employee files, but nothing stands out yet. Keep digging, Marcus said. And be careful. Whoever's behind this knows how to stay under the radar. That evening, Mr. Harris decided to stay late at the store, determined to find answers. He combed through old financial records, employee schedules, and customer complaints, looking for patterns or connections. As the hours passed, something began to emerge, a series of unusual discrepancies tied to one employee. Mark, one of Greg's closest associates. Mark had been with the store for over a decade, but his record showed a pattern of conveniently being scheduled during incidents of theft or loss. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could Mark be the mastermind Karen had warned him about? The next day, Mr. Harris watched Mark closely. On the surface, Mark seemed friendly and professional, going about his duties with a calm demeanor. But there were subtle signs that something was off. Mark often disappeared into the stockroom for long periods, claiming to be organizing inventory. He avoided eye contact with Mr. Harris and seemed overly interested in the store's security routines. That afternoon, Mr. Harris decided to confront Mark indirectly. Mark, can I see you in my office for a moment? He asked casually. Mark nodded, his expression neutral, and followed Mr. Harris into the office. Have a seat, Mr. Harris said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Mark sat down, his posture relaxed. What's up, boss? Mr. Harris studied him for a moment. I wanted to talk to you about some of the recent issues we've had in the store. Mark's expression didn't change. Issues? Yes, Mr. Harris said, leaning forward. The thefts, the sabotage. I'm sure you've heard about Greg and Lisa. Mark nodded. Yeah, it's a shame. I never would have guessed they were involved. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. Really? You worked closely with Greg. You never noticed anything suspicious. Mark shrugged. Greg kept to himself most of the time. If he was up to something, he didn't include me. Mr. Harris watched Mark carefully, searching for cracks in his calm exterior. But Mark's expression remained unreadable. Good to know, Mr. Harris said finally. Thanks for your time. Mark stood up, flashing a polite smile. Anytime, boss. As Mark left the office, Mr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. That evening, Mr. Harris called Marcus. I think Mark's involved, he said. He's too calm, too collected. It doesn't add up. Marcus sighed. I'll look into him. In the meantime, keep an eye on him. If he's part of this, he'll slip up eventually. The following night, Mr. Harris received a chilling message. Unknown number. Mark isn't the only one you should be worried about. Your daughter looks vulnerable these days. Be careful. Mr. Harris felt his chest tighten. They were targeting Ava now. He immediately checked on her, finding her asleep in her room, her favorite stuffed animal clutched in her arms. She looked so small, so innocent, and the thought of anyone threatening her filled him with rage. The next morning, Mr. Harris told Marcus about the message. "This has gone too far," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We need to set a trap. If Mark or anyone else is behind this, we'll catch them." "What kind of trap?" Mr. Harris asked. "We'll create a situation that forces them to act," Marcus explained. "Something they can't resist." The plan was set in motion later that week. Mr. Harris announced to the staff that the store would be hosting an exclusive after-hours event featuring high-end merchandise and VIP clients. The event was designed to lure out anyone planning sabotage or theft. Mark's reaction to the announcement was subtle, but Mr. Harris noticed the flicker of interest in his eyes. That evening, the store was bustling with activity as employees prepared for the event. Mark volunteered to oversee the stockroom, claiming he wanted to ensure everything ran smoothly. Marcus and his team were stationed nearby, monitoring the hidden cameras and waiting for any suspicious activity. As the event began, Mr. Harris mingled with the guests, keeping a watchful eye on Mark's movements. Then, just as the event was winding down, chaos erupted. An alarm blared from the stockroom, and Marcus's voice crackled over the earpiece. "We've got movement in the back. It's Mark." Mr. Harris rushed to the stockroom, arriving just in time to see Marcus and the officers apprehending Mark. He was caught red-handed with a bag full of stolen merchandise. But as they led Mark away, he turned to Mr. Harris with a sinister smile. "You think this is over?" Mark sneered. "You have no idea what's coming." Mark's parting words lingered in Mr. Harris's mind long after he was taken away in handcuffs. The sinister smile, the cryptic warning, it all pointed to something much larger than one man's greed. The next morning, Mr. Harris met with Marcus in the office. The detective's expression was grim, his notebook open on the desk. "We've been questioning Mark," Marcus said. "He's tight-lipped, but he's hinted at a bigger group, something organized." Mr. Harris's stomach tightened. "A group? Do you think it's the same people Karen mentioned?" "It's possible," Marcus said. "We're digging into Mark's background and connections. So far, we've found some concerning ties to the previous store owner." Mr. Harris leaned forward. "The previous owner? How?" "Mark was part of a small circle that worked closely with the old management," Marcus explained. "When you took over, it seems like they felt displaced. We suspect they've been working to undermine you ever since." Mr. Harris exhaled slowly, his mind racing. It wasn't just about sabotage or theft anymore. This was personal. "What do I do now?" he asked. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep investigating. In the meantime, you need to stay vigilant and keep Ava safe." That evening, Mr. Harris decided to have a conversation with Ava. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching in her notebook. "Sweetheart," he began, sitting down across from her. Ava looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "What's wrong, Dad?" "I need to talk to you about something important," he said carefully. "You know how I've been busy with work lately." Ava nodded. "Well, it's because there are some people who aren't happy with me owning the store," he explained. "They've been causing trouble, and I'm doing everything I can to handle it." Ava's brow furrowed. "Is that why you've been so worried?" "Yes," Mr. Harris admitted. "But I want you to know that no matter what, I'll keep you safe. You're my priority." Ava hesitated, then asked, "Do you think they'll try to hurt us?" Mr. Harris's heart ached at the fear in her voice. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "But I need you to be careful. If you ever feel unsafe, tell me immediately. Promise." "I promise," Ava said softly. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at the store remained tense. Employees avoided eye contact with Mr. Harris, and the whispers grew louder. Despite the arrests of Greg, Lisa, and now Mark, it was clear that the underlying threat hadn't disappeared. One evening as Mr. Harris was locking up, his phone buzzed. It was another message from the unknown number. "Unknown number. We warned you. Now it's her turn." Panic surged through him as he realized the message was about Ava. He raced home, calling Marcus on the way. When he arrived, he found Ava safe, watching TV in the living room. Relief washed over him, but the fear didn't fade. "What's wrong, Dad?" Ava asked, noticing his pale face. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I just wanted to check on you." Ava gave him a puzzled look, but didn't press further. The next morning, Mr. Harris decided it was time to take action. He called a meeting with his staff, determined to root out anyone still involved in the plot against him. The employees gathered in the break room, their expressions ranging from curious to nervous. Mr. Harris stood at the front, his demeanor calm but firm. "I want to address something that's been affecting all of us," he began. "As you all know, we've had some serious issues in the store recently. Issues involving theft, sabotage, and threats." The room fell silent. "I've been working with law enforcement to identify those responsible," he continued. "Several people have already been caught, but I believe there are still others involved." He let his words hang in the air, watching the employees' reactions. Some looked shocked, others avoided his gaze. "I want to give everyone a chance to come forward," Mr. Harris said. "If you've been involved, now is the time to speak up. If you're honest, I'll do what I can to help you. But if you stay silent and I find out later, there will be consequences." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. "Very well," Mr. Harris said after a long pause. "You've been warned." That evening, as Mr. Harris was closing up, he received a phone call from Marcus. "We've uncovered something big," Marcus said. "Mark finally cracked under questioning. He gave us the name of someone in your store, a senior employee." "Who?" Mr. Harris demanded. Marcus's voice was grim. "It's Karen." Mr. Harris froze. "Karen? She's already been fired." "She's still involved," Marcus said. "Mark claims she's been coordinating with others from outside the store. She's the one who's been orchestrating the sabotage." Mr. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you know where she is?" "She's been spotted near the store recently," Marcus said. "We think she's planning something. Be on high alert." The revelation that Karen was still involved hit Mr. Harris like a ton of bricks. Despite firing her and confronting the initial wave of sabotage, she had somehow remained a shadowy presence, pulling strings from the outside. That night, he stayed late at the store, determined to catch any signs of her activity. Marcus had assured him that the police were keeping an eye on Karen, but Mr. Harris felt a personal responsibility to protect his store, and most importantly, Ava. As he walked through the quiet aisles, the lights dimmed for closing, he thought he heard faint footsteps. He paused, straining to listen. The sound stopped. "Hello," he called out. Silence. He shook his head, dismissing it as his nerves playing tricks on him. But as he turned back toward his office, a figure darted past the end of the aisle. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firm. No response. Mr. Harris reached for his phone, dialing Marcus's number. "Marcus, I think someone's in the store," he said quietly. "Stay put," Marcus replied. "I'm sending a unit over now. Lock yourself in your office if you can." Mr. Harris nodded, slipping into the back office and locking the door behind him. He pulled up the security feed on his computer, scanning the cameras for movement. Near the stockroom, he saw a figure in a hoodie rummaging through boxes. The person moved quickly, their face obscured. "Got you," Mr. Harris muttered, switching to another angle to get a better view. As the figure turned slightly, Mr. Harris froze. It wasn't Karen. It was someone else, someone younger, with a build that seemed familiar. His heart sank as the realization hit him. It was one of his employees, Rachel, a part-timer who had always seemed quiet and unassuming. By the time Marcus and the officers arrived, Rachel was gone, leaving behind a mess of overturned boxes and scattered merchandise. "She must have known we were coming," Marcus said, inspecting the scene. "Rachel," Mr. Harris said, still stunned. I never would have guessed she was involved. She probably wasn't working alone, Marcus said. Karen might have recruited her. We'll bring her in for questioning. Mr. Harris nodded, his mind racing. If Rachel was part of Karen's network, how many others were still out there? The next day, Rachel didn't show up for her shift. Marcus sent officers to her house, but she wasn't there. Her phone was off, and none of her coworkers had heard from her. Mr. Harris addressed his staff once again, his patience wearing thin. I know some of you are scared, he said, his tone sharp. But this has gone too far. If you know anything about Rachel's whereabouts or Karen's activities, now is the time to come forward. He scanned the room, noting the nervous glances exchanged among the employees, but no one spoke up. That evening, Mr. Harris received another message from the unknown number. Unknown number. Losing your grip, aren't you? Maybe it's time to step down before things get worse. His hands clenched into fists. Whoever was behind these threats wanted him to quit, to walk away from everything he had worked for. But he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. He showed the message to Marcus, who nodded grimly. They're trying to break you, Marcus said. Don't let them. I won't, Mr. Harris said firmly. But we need to find Rachel. She's the key to all of this. 2 days later, Rachel was spotted on a security camera at a warehouse several miles from the store. Marcus and his team raided the location, finding Rachel along with Karen and several other individuals. The group had been using the warehouse to store stolen merchandise and plan further sabotage. Karen, looking disheveled but defiant, glared at Mr. Harris as she was led away in handcuffs. You think this ends with me? She sneered. You have no idea what you're up against. Mr. Harris stared her down, his expression unyielding. We'll see about that. Back at the store, the mood was a mix of relief and unease. With Karen in custody, the immediate threat seemed to have passed, but Mr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that her warning wasn't an idle threat. The next morning, as he was reviewing the store's records, Ava burst into his office, her face pale. Dad, she said, her voice shaking. There's someone outside. Mr. Harris's heart dropped. Who is it? I don't know, Ava said, but they're just standing there staring at the house. Mr. Harris grabbed his phone and called Marcus, then moved to the front window. Sure enough, the figure was standing at the edge of the driveway, their face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. As the sirens of approaching police cars filled the air, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The shadowy figure disappearing into the night was a chilling reminder for Mr. Harris. This wasn't over. The police combed the area around his home, but they found no sign of the person Ava had seen. Marcus stayed late into the night, helping Mr. Harris install additional security cameras and advising him on ways to keep Ava safe. They're trying to intimidate you, Marcus said as he drilled a new lock onto the front door. But whoever it is, they're getting desperate. That's when people like this make mistakes. I just want Ava to be safe, Mr. Harris said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. She will be, Marcus assured him. But you have to stay vigilant. Don't let your guard down. The next morning, Mr. Harris arrived at the store early, determined to push forward. He met with his remaining employees, addressing the situation head-on. Karen and Rachel are in custody, he began. But I know there are still questions about what's been happening here. He paused, scanning their faces. Some looked relieved, while others seemed nervous. I want to make one thing clear. I will not tolerate any further sabotage or threats, he continued. If anyone here knows anything about what's been going on, now is the time to speak up. The room remained silent. Very well, Mr. Harris said, his voice firm. Let's get back to work. That afternoon, Marcus called with an update. We've been interrogating Karen and Rachel, he said. Karen's still defiant, but Rachel's starting to crack. She claims Karen was just one part of a larger group, and there's someone else pulling the strings. Who? Mr. Harris asked, his grip tightening on the phone. She didn't give a name, but she mentioned someone she called the architect. Apparently, this person has been orchestrating the entire operation, everything from the thefts to the threats. The architect? Mr. Harris repeated, the name sending a chill down his spine. Do you think it's someone inside the store? It's possible, Marcus said. But it could also be someone with ties to the previous owner. We're looking into it. That evening, as Mr. Harris was closing up, he decided to review the store's records again. He hoped to find some clue about the architect, but the files offered little insight. Just as he was about to give up for the night, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an alert from one of the new security cameras Marcus had installed at the store. The camera had captured a figure moving near the loading dock. Mr. Harris's heart pounded as he watched the live feed. The figure was dressed in black, their face obscured by a mask. They moved quickly, cutting through the chain on the gate and slipping inside. He called Marcus immediately. There's someone breaking into the store right now, he said, his voice urgent. I'm on my way, Marcus replied. Stay put. Don't confront them. But Mr. Harris couldn't wait. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back of the store, determined to catch the intruder. As he approached the loading dock, he heard the faint sound of boxes being opened. He peered around the corner and saw the masked figure rifling through a shipment of electronics. Hey! Mr. Harris shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. The figure froze for a moment, then bolted toward the exit. Mr. Harris gave chase, his adrenaline pumping. Stop, he yelled, but the intruder didn't slow down. They darted through the aisles, knocking over displays in an attempt to slow him down. Mr. Harris kept running, determined not to let them escape. As they reached the front of the store, the intruder turned abruptly and swung a metal rod they had picked up along the way. Mr. Harris ducked just in time, the rod missing him by inches. Before the intruder could swing again, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed outside as police cars pulled into the parking lot. The intruder hesitated, then dropped the rod and sprinted toward the emergency exit. Marcus and his team arrived just in time to intercept them. The officers tackled the figure to the ground, pulling off their mask to reveal a face Mr. Harris didn't recognize. Who are you? Marcus demanded, pinning the person's arms behind their back. The intruder glared up at him, their face twisted in defiance. You'll never stop us, they spat. The architect will make sure of that. Later that night, Marcus and Mr. Harris sat in the office, reviewing the footage of the break-in. This person isn't on your staff, Marcus said. But they clearly knew their way around the store. They must have had help from someone on the inside. Mr. Harris nodded, his jaw tight. Did they say anything about the architect? Nothing useful, Marcus said. But it's clear this person is a foot soldier, someone following orders. The architect is still out there. The revelation of the architect sent a fresh wave of unease through Mr. Harris. The shadowy figure was clearly orchestrating the chaos that had infiltrated his life, and each step closer to uncovering their identity seemed to bring new dangers. The intruder caught during the break-in refused to provide useful information, only confirming the presence of a larger network. As Marcus continued his investigation, Mr. Harris focused on fortifying the store's security and ensuring Eva's safety. That morning, as Mr. Harris dropped Eva off at school, she seemed quieter than usual. Is everything okay, sweetheart? He asked, watching her adjust her backpack. Eva hesitated. Some kids at school said things about you, she admitted. They said you're in trouble and that bad people are after us. Mr. Harris felt his chest tighten. What kids? Just some kids in my class, Eva said, looking down. They said their parents heard it on the news. Mr. Harris knelt down to her level, his voice gentle but firm. Listen to me, Eva. There are people trying to make things hard for us, but we're going to be okay. I promise. Eva nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with worry. Just focus on school, Mr. Harris said. Let me handle the rest. Back at the store, the tension among the staff was palpable. The arrests of Greg, Lisa, Rachel, and the masked intruder had left everyone on edge. Mr. Harris noticed that some employees avoided eye contact with him, while others whispered in corners. He decided to address the team directly, hoping to reestablish trust. We've been through a lot recently, he began, standing at the front of the break room. But I need you all to know that I'm committed to this store and to each of you. If you have any concerns or information that might help, my door is always open." The employees nodded, but their expressions remained guarded. That afternoon, Marcus called with an update. "We've been digging into the architect," he said. Rachel's finally started talking. She claims the architect is someone with ties to the old management, someone who feels like you took what should have been theirs. Mr. Harris frowned. "Does she have a name?" "She's only heard the architect referred to as the founder," Marcus said. "It's vague, but it might be a lead." "The founder," Mr. Harris repeated. "Could it be the previous owner?" "We're looking into it," Marcus said. "But I want you to be careful. If this person feels like you're getting close, they might escalate." That evening, Mr. Harris stayed late at the store, reviewing old documents from the previous owner. He combed through contracts, sales records, and employee files, searching for anything that might point to the founder. Then, in a dusty file tucked at the back of the cabinet, he found something intriguing: an old business card with the name Thomas Prescott. Thomas Prescott had been the original owner of the store, selling it to Mr. Harris after financial struggles forced him to step away. The card listed a contact number, though Mr. Harris wasn't sure if it was still active. He decided to call. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "This is Thomas Prescott," the voice said. "Mr. Prescott, this is James Harris," he began, his tone cautious. There was a pause. "Ah, the man who bought my store," Prescott said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I have some questions," Mr. Harris said, "about the store and the people who used to work there." Prescott chuckled darkly. "I'm not sure I can help you. That store's not my problem anymore." "But you're still connected to it, aren't you?" Mr. Harris pressed. "What are you getting at?" Prescott asked, his tone sharp. Mr. Harris hesitated, then decided to go for it. "Are you the founder? Are you the one orchestrating this?" The line went silent for a moment. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," Prescott said finally. "You should have stayed out of it." The line went dead. Mr. Harris sat back, his heart racing. Prescott's response all but confirmed his suspicions. He immediately called Marcus, recounting the conversation. "Prescott's definitely involved," Marcus said. "But if he's the architect, he's not working alone. We need to find out who else is in his network." The next day, as Mr. Harris arrived at the store, he noticed something unusual. A car he didn't recognize was parked near the loading dock. He approached cautiously, noting the tinted windows and the engine idling. As he got closer, the driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit. "Mr. Harris," the man said, his tone polite but icy. "We need to talk." "Who are you?" Mr. Harris asked, his instincts on high alert. "My name isn't important," the man replied. "But I represent people who have a vested interest in this store. People who aren't happy with the way you've been running things." Mr. Harris clenched his fists. "Let me guess, you work for Prescott." The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say we're aligned. And we're here to offer you a choice: step down and sell the store back, or face consequences you won't like." Mr. Harris's jaw tightened. "I'm not going anywhere." The man's smile disappeared. "That's unfortunate. But don't say we didn't warn you." The car sped off, leaving Mr. Harris standing in the lot, his mind racing. Mr. Harris stood in the parking lot, the man's parting words ringing in his ears. The threat was no longer subtle. It was explicit, direct, and chilling. This wasn't just about the store anymore. It was about everything he had built, including Eva's safety. He immediately called Marcus. "They're getting bolder," Mr. Harris said, recounting the encounter. "They told me to step down or face consequences." Marcus's voice was steady but concerned. "They're escalating because they're losing control. We've tightened the net around them, and they know it. But this also makes them dangerous. We need to act fast." "What's the next step?" Mr. Harris asked. "We'll put a tail on Prescott," Marcus said. "If he's the architect, he's likely working with others. We need to find out who his allies are and how deep this goes." That evening, Mr. Harris couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. After putting Ava to bed, he stayed up late, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. He couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Around midnight, his phone buzzed. It was another message from the unknown number. "Unknown number. We warned you. This is on you now." A moment later, the house's security alarm blared. Mr. Harris bolted upright, his heart pounding. He grabbed his phone and rushed to Ava's room. She was already awake, clutching her stuffed animal, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Stay with me," he said, pulling her close. He checked the security cameras on his phone. One of the exterior cameras showed movement near the back fence, a shadowy figure slipping into the yard. He called Marcus. "Someone's on my property," Mr. Harris said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm sending units now," Marcus replied. "Stay inside and keep Ava safe." Mr. Harris locked the bedroom door and sat with Ava, his arm around her as they waited. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air. The intruder fled, but the police found signs of tampering near the back gate and footprints leading to the woods behind the house. "They're testing you," Marcus said as he inspected the scene, "trying to see how far they can push you before you break." Mr. Harris's jaw tightened. They're not going to win. The next day, Mr. Harris returned to the store with renewed determination. He called an emergency meeting with Marcus and a team of investigators, sharing everything he knew about Prescott, the threats, and the group's possible next moves. "We need to shut this down before someone gets hurt," Mr. Harris said. Marcus nodded. "We've been monitoring Prescott's movements. He's meeting with someone this afternoon, a known associate of his who has ties to organized crime. This could be our chance to gather concrete evidence." "What can I do?" Mr. Harris asked. "Stay visible," Marcus said. "Keep running the store like normal. If they think you're intimidated, they'll press harder. But if you show strength, it might throw them off." That afternoon, while Marcus and his team tracked Prescott's meeting, Mr. Harris focused on maintaining a sense of normalcy at the store. He greeted customers, checked in with employees, and worked on rebuilding trust among his staff. But as the hours passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His instincts were right. Around 5 p.m., one of his employees rushed into the office, her face pale. "Mr. Harris, there's a group of men outside," she said. "They're asking for you." Mr. Harris stood, his heart pounding. He stepped outside to find 3 men standing near the entrance. They were dressed sharply, but their expressions were cold and menacing. "Mr. Harris," one of them said, stepping forward. "We're here to deliver a message." "Go ahead," Mr. Harris said, keeping his voice steady. The man smiled faintly. "Prescott wants you to know that this store was never yours to take. You have until the end of the week to sign it back over to him. If you don't, things will get unpleasant." Mr. Harris folded his arms. "Tell Prescott I'm not going anywhere." The man's smile disappeared. "You've been warned." The group turned and walked away, their departure leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. That evening, Marcus called with another update. "We intercepted Prescott's meeting," Marcus said. "It was about you. They're planning something big, a final move to force you out." "What is it?" Mr. Harris asked. "We don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "But they're desperate, which means they're dangerous. We're putting surveillance on Prescott and his associates around the clock." That night, Mr. Harris sat at the kitchen table, going over his options. He could fight, but at what cost? Ava's safety was his top priority, and the thought of putting her in harm's way was unbearable. But giving up wasn't an option either. As he sat there, lost in thought, Ava walked in, her small frame wrapped in a blanket. "Dad," she said softly. He looked up, forcing a smile. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I know you're trying to protect me," she said. "But I don't want you to give up. You worked so hard for the store. It's yours." Mr. Harris felt a lump in his throat. "I'm not giving up," he said, pulling her into a hug. "We're going to get through this together." The morning air was thick with tension as Mr. Harris arrived at the store. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the threats from Prescott's men. But Ava's words echoed in his heart, giving him the strength to face whatever was coming. By now, Marcus's team had uncovered more about Prescott's plans. The surveillance had revealed multiple meetings between Prescott and key players in his network, all pointing to one final scheme: a coordinated attack on the store to drive Mr. Harris out once and for all. "They're planning to create chaos," Marcus had warned. "Vandalism, staged incidents, maybe even violence. They want to make it impossible for you to stay in business." At noon, Mr. Harris called his staff together for a meeting. He didn't share every detail, but he made it clear that the store was under threat. "I know things have been tense," he said, "but I need you all to stay strong. This store is more than just a business. It's a place where people come to feel welcome, valued, and respected. We won't let anyone take that away." The employees nodded, their determination matching his own. That evening, as the store prepared to close, Marcus arrived with a team of undercover officers. They positioned themselves discreetly throughout the building, ready to respond to any trouble. The first sign of trouble came just after sunset. A car screeched into the parking lot, and 3 masked individuals jumped out, carrying baseball bats. They began smashing windows and spray painting hateful messages on the walls. Inside, Mr. Harris and Marcus watched the security feed. "This is it," Marcus said, signaling his team. The officers moved swiftly, surrounding the intruders and apprehending them before they could cause further damage. But the night wasn't over. An hour later, another group arrived, this time posing as customers. They entered the store in pairs, their behavior suspicious. They moved erratically, knocking over displays and creating disturbances. Marcus's team was ready. The officers intercepted the group, discovering hidden tools in their bags meant for sabotage. One of the individuals tried to escape, but Mr. Harris stepped in their path. "Not this time," he said firmly. The person hesitated, then bolted toward the exit, only to be caught by Marcus waiting outside. As the chaos subsided, Marcus pulled Mr. Harris aside. "We've rounded up everyone Prescott sent," Marcus said, "but there's still no sign of him. He's the last piece of the puzzle." Mr. Harris nodded. "We have to end this tonight." The breakthrough came when one of the detained individuals, under pressure from Marcus, revealed Prescott's location. He was at a nearby warehouse, overseeing the operation from a distance. Marcus and his team moved quickly, taking Mr. Harris along as a witness. When they arrived, the warehouse was dark, its windows glowing faintly from inside. The officers surrounded the building, and Marcus signaled for them to move in. Inside, Prescott was sitting at a desk, reviewing papers. He looked up as the officers entered, his face twisting into a sneer. Well, Prescott said, leaning back in his chair. "The new owner finally decided to confront me." "This ends now," Mr. Harris said, stepping forward. Prescott smirked. "You think you've won? This store was my legacy. You had no right to take it." "I didn't take anything," Mr. Harris replied. "You sold it because you couldn't manage it. I'd earned my place here." Prescott's expression darkened. "You think you can keep it? My people will always be there waiting to make your life miserable." "Not anymore," Marcus said, stepping closer. "We have enough evidence to charge you and dismantle your entire operation. It's over." Prescott's bravado faltered as the officers cuffed him. The next morning, Mr. Harris returned to the store. The damage from the previous night was still visible, but the atmosphere felt lighter, freer. His employees greeted him with smiles, their relief palpable. Together, they began cleaning up and rebuilding, determined to restore the store's former glory. Later, Ava arrived after school, running into her father's arms. "Is it over, Dad?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Mr. Harris said, holding her tightly. "It's over." The story ends with the store thriving once again, a testament to Mr. Harris's resilience and determination. Though the scars of the ordeal remained, he and Avad emerged stronger, knowing they had faced the storm and won.